you so much for attending, for those of us here and also those of us online. And so today's conversation really is a talk. It's going to look at heritage tourism in Africa, and it's saying that how do we move beyond monuments to also consider living traditions. So very quickly, Red Clay is a tourism consultancy. Our work is focused on tourism development, particularly looking at tourism that works for Africa. And we will unpack what that can mean over the course of this talk. A lot of our clients are really governments, state governments, federal governments, as well as we also have private investors, particularly looking at how we can strengthen public-private partnerships for tourism destination development in Africa. And it's really about tourism strategy, master plans, feasibility studies, etc. And today I'm very happy to be here at the School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool. And I was talking earlier that a lot of the work we do, we have to interact with architects as well as urban planners, because you can't have tourism destinations without designing what these destinations actually look like. So why are we looking at heritage tourism in Africa, and what's really important about it? So my practice in tourism has actually been about 20 years now, and in that time I have seen a movement and a shift looking at saying, what should a tourism destination offer, and how should this destination really differentiate itself from other forms of destinations? And many times we've had to tell clients that perhaps you don't want to be the next Bahamas, or perhaps you don't want to be the next Dubai. Perhaps it's important to think about what is authentic to your destination, to your communities, and really see how we can elevate these sites, these monuments, to create experiences that can work. But then what has happened is that traditionally there's a focus on heritage tourism that sees the monuments. So you have the monuments, you have the sites, you have the museums, but then there's a tension between that, because historically, a lot of these monuments and museums have really focused on colonial narratives and post-colonial history of the destinations and the communities. And so it's that question of how do we actually go to pre-colonial times? How do we understand how these spaces have evolved and what has shaped their evolution over time? And then beyond that, it's also saying, right, you have a tourist that has traveled all the way. So for example, there's an example I like to give, which you drive 8 hours from Lagos, which is where our office is based in Nigeria. You go to Ondo State to hike the hills. And then we've seen the site, you've seen it's beautiful, you've seen the little communities, but there's nothing else to interact with the space. And it's that question of how do we create more experiences that can enhance the visitor experience, but also create a way that people can stay for longer than 1 day, 4 hours. And then you wonder, what can I do? Okay, nothing else to do. And that's the end of that. So it's that sense of how do we create more living traditions, how do we create more immersive experiences, and how do we make these more dynamic? But again, even within that, there has been some tension that I will share. So this is going to be really sharing from some of our clients' work, some of our practices, with a little bit of theoretical perspective. Well, I would say that this is an exciting time in African tourism development. I think this is a very interesting time in our tourism development life cycle, because it really gives us opportunity to think about how we can shape tourism development, look at it from a sustainable form, learn from other tourism destination development that has happened around the world, see how we can avoid making their mistakes, and see how we can adapt some of their best practices. What I would say particularly for us is really also key in our development trajectory to see how we can strengthen a sense of identity, a sense of cultural pride, a sense of being able to anchor people to their spaces, and being able to see how from that we can create economic empowerment. Heritage tourism also provides an avenue to stem rural to urban migration. So it really looks at how we can retain more people in our rural communities and our secondary towns. And then we also then say, how do we then engage with the world? How do we engage globally from a position of strength? So I'll just share a few pictures of some of the work we've done, very, very high level. So this is a lake in Ibadan. So the Oyo State government was one of our clients last year. And we're tasked with saying, okay, they've got this huge lake, as you can see, in Ibadan. And it's that sense of what can we do with it? This is really where we are in terms of heritage tourism. Now, just a point of clarification. Because we're focused on heritage tourism, and because most of the time it has to do with sites, Some of these sites are underdeveloped, they are underutilized, but these sites are not representative of what Africa looks like or what Nigeria looks like. This is just because of the topic and the theme that we're talking about today. So I just wanted to clarify that. So a lot of these sites and monuments are in unspoiled areas and not yet harnessed as they can be. So this is Eleyele Lake that has now started some water-based, water sports activities. You can kayak there and you can swim, but really there's not so much happening there. And so we're tasked to come up with how they can think about the programming and how they can rethink it. And I'll share some of the examples of what we came up with for them. This is, the example for this conversation is really focused on Oyo State. This is another location, Idere Hills, and particularly because of the cultural and spiritual the syncretic nature of the culture and spiritual in how cultures that evolved and formed, you will see that many of these spaces are seen as of spiritual significance. People look at them as sacred sites. And part of this is also, can explain some of the reason for their underdevelopment, because I'm going to speak later on about some of the tension between the cultural and the spiritual and how these have been influenced by the Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam particularly. And so this has also led to some of their underdevelopment. And then this is the suspended lake, and this is just showing you what it looked like as at last year. So this is 2024. As you can see, like I said, because we're still at the beginning phase of our tourism area life cycle, right, we're really at the exploration and involvement space, moving into development. There's just so much opportunities to move from involvement, exploration, development, before we get to consolidation. And I would say this is actually an exciting time to be involved in tourism development as a whole, but particularly heritage tourism development on the continent. Other parts of the world that have really have more experienced tourism destination development are really looking at areas of consolidation. Some of them have gone into stagnation, decline. But one thing about decline as well is that there comes a point where you can start to think about rejuvenation and coming up with innovative and new ways to approach tourism development. But I think before we assume that everyone, sorry. Oops. Let's escape.
Just a minute, we just want to okay. Yes, so we are just going to restart. Okay. Is it fine?
No, we have to share the screen. We have to share the screen.
Video.
How do you sign it?
Well, I can see Martin. Hello, Martin.
Okay. So let's share the screen.
Where is it? Where is it?
Okay, are we back? Thank you. Are we back on? I'll just continue. Okay, so before I assume that everyone knows what I mean by tourism, I think it's important to really explain what tourism refers to. And it refers to people traveling for business or leisure from a place outside of their home city or their place of residence for longer than 24 hours. And this definition is important because it means that if you go for longer than 24 hours, then you're staying somewhere overnight, right? But it also means that particularly when we think about tourism development in Africa, especially when I talk to my clients in East Africa and West Africa, we're focused on international tourists. And it's important for us to understand that we can have domestic tourism where people can go from there. So for example, I've come from London, I'm going to be here in Liverpool, I'm going to be there for more than 24 hours. So for the purposes of classification, I am a tourist in Liverpool, which is very different from those of us that live in Liverpool, and and can be the same for people that have come from Nigeria, which is where I live, and have come and they will be seen as international tourists. So we have domestic tourists, we have international tourists. But it's also important in the tourism development discourse to think about the residents. So how do we also develop tourism that considers the residents in these spaces as well, not only as stakeholders of the host communities, but also as visitors to these tourist sites. This is one gap that I see that we still have in Western Africa particularly, where it's seen that the tourist is an international person, as an international visitor coming from outside of the country. But there's so much opportunity that has been overlooked in terms of domestic tourism and residents that are exploring their own communities and other areas within their local spaces. And this is an important component of the available visitor market. In the United Kingdom, domestic tourism accounts for a much more significant number than international tourism. Same with India. And if you look at, it's just that we don't classify this data. If you look at other parts of the world as well, even in America and the United States, domestic tourism accounts for a much larger significant number of tourists than international tourists. And I'm not saying that we don't have domestic tourism in Africa or West Africa or in Nigeria. It's that we don't really understand and classify it as it should, particularly because we have a lot of activities that go about in terms of visiting friends and relatives, traveling for ceremonies, traveling for someone's birthday, traveling for someone's activities. Okay, people are sorry, I'm just going to admit people. Traveling for different purposes, right? And we don't see them or think about them as tourists. And so understanding that helps us to plan strategically for them, so that if someone is visiting a community or a village or a town for a few days for a ceremony, they understand that they can also engage with the community itself outside of the ceremony that they have. And this is just the tourism system, just to help us understand that tourism is a system made up of interconnected components, looking at the attractions, looking at the people, in tourists, looking at the services and facilities that have to be at destination, looking at the transportation, how people get there, looking at communication about the destination, also thinking about host culture, and also thinking about the heritage, which is where we are. So people and places where we are, built heritage, natural heritage, and then thinking about how do we bring all of this together to shape the information, the image, perception, etc. around the space. But particularly it's about ensuring that tourists have things to do and things to see and things to satisfy them when they do come and when they do travel. And I always like to show us this because most times when people think about tourist destinations, we think about the monuments. We go to the monument and that's it. But there's so much else that needs to be considered that we are not considering as we ought to. Very quickly, I think we all know what the difference between tangible heritage and intangible heritage is. So tangible is something you can touch, see, monuments, buildings, religious sites, museums, and intangible, really looking at practices, knowledge, stories, skills, traditions passed down from generations. Some of these include craftsmanship, traditional medicine, rituals, ceremonies, festivals, performing arts. Now, when we think about heritage tourism in Africa, it's also important to know that Africa is not homogeneous. It's 54 countries with thousands of tribes, cultures, languages, traditions. And to also think about who is the tourist in Africa, and this is someone who is seeking discovery, authenticity, and meaningful experiences. And this is just to say, I would say that this is what most tourists are looking for, no matter where you are. The tourist in Africa is like a tourist elsewhere. They're going looking for the same type of things. It's just that they understand that the environment and the context is they understand that the environment and the context is different. And I just like to share this example as a way to really help us to see how intangible heritage and living traditions need to be elevated, and for us to really start to think about them from an opportunity perspective in terms of how we look at heritage tourism development. So ikebana is art, traditional Japanese flower arrangement, and it's a practice that I have loved for a very long time, and it's something that I'm learning. I've actually enrolled in classes to learn the art of flower arrangement. But one area that I find very interesting is that by learning about ikebana, which is this arrangement system, you really start to learn about the philosophy of the Japanese people. You learn about their culture, you learn about their traditions, you learn about how this was a practice that has continued for, I think, 45 generations now. This is the Ikenobo school, which is the school that was the masters were those that served the emperors. But you also learn about Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, you learn about Shintoism, and you really understand the imperial history of the Japanese people. And this is just from a practice that you can do, well, I have a Japanese teacher, but you can do from anywhere in the world, really. But what it does is that it shows you how a tangible practice and its intangible tradition has been able to come together to create a stronger attachment to Japan and a stronger attachment to the culture in Japan, which also helps us to really think about immersive traditions, but creates a strong pull factor for me to want to always return to Japan. And I would say that this is one area that we have a lot of similar cultural experiences in Africa. One area that I find very interesting is that we have so many similarities in terms of even our indigenous knowledge systems and our traditional religion practices. I was going to share an image, but I didn't hear, where we went to Anambra, we were doing some work in Anambra, and the images of the shrines and how they tied cloth to wires around the shrine is exactly the same as the Tanabata in Japan, where they write wishes as prayers and they tied. And I was showing them in Anambra that, oh my gosh, this is very similar to Japan, and they were like, gosh, goodness. And I was also showing the Japanese, and they were very surprised to see that these are so similar. And it's important because sometimes when we think about what makes us different, we have to also see that there's so much that connects us over time. I just put this as a fun thing to say that mastering the art of using these scissors is very interesting, very different from normal scissors. And you start to think about, how was the craftsmanship? What made them evolve in this way? Why are their scissors very different in terms of ikebana to normal traditional scissors that we're used to? But even then, you start to question, what is traditional? Why do we think the one we're used to is the traditional and this is the different? For Japanese ikebana per se, this is the traditional, and the one we're using is different. But we don't really have too much time to go into Orientalism and what we want towards now. But it's the question of how do we create our tourism experiences and our cultural experiences to make them more immersive and to make them more relevant to people around the world. I've already mentioned this, right? But just very quickly is to just talk about examples that we have. And something that's really helping now in terms of heritage tourism is the designation of as World Heritage Sites. So as UNESCO designates them as World Heritage Sites, you have governments now and policymakers now paying more attention and saying, oh, how do we get this designation? What do we need to do to get this designation? And so that is also helping to shape the prioritization of heritage tourism in Africa. I would say that over the last, I said I've been in the industry for 20 years, over the last 5 years, there has really been a move towards people saying, you know what, we just don't want to develop a resort or an island, we really want to look at heritage tourism development. So that's a great thing. And just as an example, I saw this online, this is Berufu Island in Badagry, which is known as the point of no return, but now called point of return. And this is Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. Like I mentioned earlier, these monuments are tied to slave history, colonial history, but then you always ask yourself, when I've been to Badagry, I tend to ask them, what did you do before this happened? What were your practices? How do we create experiences so that, yes, we can learn about the slave trade, we can learn about slave history, but we can also learn about your culture and your sense of people. There's an opportunity for culinary tourism, your festivals, your rituals, your traditions. How do we create more expansive tourism experiences? Same as in Cape Coast Castle. So it's these questions that we look at as well to say, how do we elevate and enhance our programming in some of these sites that already have such fractured history. Like I mentioned earlier, it's important that we see that we don't look at one size fitting all. We look at a systematic approach, and we look at how we can really strengthen the communities within which these destinations are located to help them to understand the value of what they have, but to also really help them to see that people can be interested in this. So I mentioned Idore Hills earlier, and I'm going to go back to it again very quickly, which is, I remember when we're visiting Idore Hills, as most people do, they were like, okay, Adrian, can we tell the tour guide we had a tour guide, but the tour guide believed all he needed to do was take us to the monument and hike the hills. And so I started asking, what are the myths that used to happen here? What are the stories that used to happen here? Who used to live in these places? And he was shocked that we wanted to know that. He thought, why would you want to know this? And he said, because this is what is important about you. And this shows us also the importance of us teaching people and creating cultural education, which I'll talk about in a bit, that would help us to also understand the value, the inherent value within our living traditions. I think I've spoken enough about Japan, so before people think this is a Japanese tourism promotion talk, I'll just move very quickly. But an example is just how when you go to Japan and visit a temple, you can visit a temple, so you can visit a monument, but you can also participate in different ceremonies that would help you to connect more strongly to the place. And why is this important? I think I've mentioned about the destination sites for UNESCO, but it's also because it's quite strategic as crucial. There's a demand, especially after the pandemic, there's really been a demand for more meaningful participatory immersive tourism experiences. With the AFTA, so the African Continental Trade Agreement in the trade area, they want to strengthen how we can move more people within the continent. So again, I don't know if we can go into this, but again, trade routes are really moving people out of the continent, and even for tourism, it's very difficult to move people within the continent for intra-Africa travel. Sometimes it's easier to come to the West, Europe, before you can fly back in to visit another country on the continent. And so AFTA is really saying, how do we strengthen the movement of people and goods? And so these conversations show that heritage tourism and moving towards living traditions can be quite strategic in seeing how we can address that. Similarly, the African Union has a 2063 agenda that is looking at how to strengthen the continent, and one of the areas they've identified is cultural renaissance as a priority area to promote a stronger sense of shared identity and heritage. Similarly, with Instagram, with the internet, etc., digital storytelling is also making a lot of African culture and African destinations and African heritage more accessible. So the question is, people have seen it, now they want to visit. So can we give them somewhere that they can visit? And I just have to say here that, please, we cannot yet go to virtual reality, augmented reality. Why? If you remember the pictures I shared at the start, putting these spaces up as virtual reality doesn't really elevate the experience. We still need to invest in the infrastructure to enhance how these spaces are before we can start moving to VR. I know many people are very happy when I tell them that, because I'm like, why would you put an image that doesn't, why would you move that to the virtual space without enhancing what you're offering, first of all? But also from a political economy perspective as well, there's a potential that we can use our focus on living traditions to strengthen our soft power, that can really strengthen our vehicle for international trade. China does this very well. Whenever you visit China for business, before they even start talking about business, they have to talk you through their heritage, how they formed industrialization, how they've been able to develop strong industries, how their culture was a strong part of this, etc. And this just strengthens the bargaining angle for them before they even start the conversation. It will be important if you're going for a meeting in a place on the continent, and we already start the conversations from these positions of understanding, but also positions of really valuing our indigenous knowledge systems, our culture, our people as areas of strength. But particularly, it really also helps to stem the erosion of many of these cultural practices and ways of life, and addresses homogenization of tourism destinations, where I have a colleague that used to be in Edinburgh, Stephen Howard, who does a lot of work on authentic tourist experiences and the need for us to really, really consider that we don't want homogeneous tourism destinations around the world. And so it's about creating a unique sense of place and a unique sense of being. And also right now, like I said, it's strategic and crucial. Right now on the continent, we have so many things working for us. We have communities that have unbroken direct links to ancient traditions and practices. We have rich cultural expressions that we can see how they're integrated into daily life. They're not simply historic recreations. We have traditions that can be experienced in their original context, not necessarily in museum settings. And we have archaeological sites that offer ongoing discoveries and interpretations that are still evolving. And the fact that there's less commercial development right now also creates opportunities to shape how this development happens. And the rich variety of traditional knowledge systems strengthens the sustainability practices. One of our clients is Anambra government. We're working on a few sites with them. And one of this is Agri Lake, which I think we went 2 weeks ago. And they've got the spiritual practice because the crocodiles and the lake is seen as a sacred area. What that has meant is that nobody kills the crocodiles, and so we were able to see these huge crocodiles, and so the indigenous knowledge system, the spiritual practice, has actually been a way of conserving and protecting the crocodiles, right, and the biodiversity in the lake, which creates an opportunity for tourism development that is done in a sympathetic and respectful way. And I don't know, we'll see if we have time, I can go a bit into that. But a lot more advantages, I would say. We have diverse cosmologies. I'm really learning more about our indigenous religion now and seeing so many similarities between quite a few of the indigenous knowledge practices. And these worldviews also provide an alternative perspective of seeing the world. So if you think about, eat, pray, love, or you think about how Buddhism, yoga, etc., really provided a way for us to see the world differently, I would argue that when we consider our traditional religion and some of these cosmologies and worldviews, they can enrich how we see the world. We have traditional healing practices and ethnobotanical knowledge. I wrote here that you have traditional Chinese medicine, right? Perhaps it's time to also think about traditional Nigerian medicine, traditional Ghanaian medicine. It's literally a world waiting to be harnessed and discovered. And also because of where we are in terms of our cultural and natural landscapes, we have stronger ties between natural and cultural heritage. We have sacred sites that can actually show you the integration of spiritual practices into the lives of people. So basically what this means is that we're not talking about going to a site and being told this is how they used to do it in those days. These activities are still being practiced. So it provides the opportunity to experience what is going on currently in their unspoiled forms. And it also provides African interpretations and contributes African interpretations of history and culture, and provides a way for us to reframe colonial narratives and strong opportunities to strengthen, strong opportunities for communities to also take ownership of their identity, their sustainability practices, their economic requirements as communities, and really look as though they are agents of their own change and development. This is an ideal situation. This is not what is happening in practice, but this is an ideal situation of the opportunities that heritage tourism can offer. And I just feel like we can't talk about monuments without mentioning museums very quickly. It's important to look at museums, and I smile because there's a lot of conversation that's currently happening in terms of repatriation, etc. I don't want to talk about repatriation because that's also tension, etc. But it's important to understand that museum culture exists for the collection, preservation, and showcasing of artifacts for public education. This has very strong roots in Western tradition. But also to understand that the concept of preserving and showcasing cultural knowledge, history, and artistic expressions also exist within African traditions, although this happens in different forms. So the question is, how do we design the museums of the future? How do we think about what this should look like? There's argument that our culture is not one of having these artifacts as objects to look at, but they were objects for ceremonial use, they were objects for use in the home, they were objects for spiritual significance and relevance. And so how do we think about this, and how do we imagine this that can work for the continent? And to do this, both the intangible and tangible forms of heritage have to work together. Can we start to think of museums as living spaces to more interactive spaces, community-centered experiences? Can we really start to think about the role of traditional rulers and their palaces? Can they become spaces for experiencing some of these artifacts? And maybe afterwards, if we have questions, I can share a bit more. But it's because when you see the museums currently, particularly older museums, they're in conditions of disrepair because of lack of patronage, lack of investments, lack of renovation, etc. And it's that question of, is this representative of who we are, and how do we make this more representative of who we are? I would say it's about design, it's about programming, and there are places already that are doing and shaping some of these types of museum experience. So we have foundations, we have a New Bouquet Foundation, we have more kind of South Africa that are really questioning what can a museum look like within the community in Africa, and how do we also ensure that it really celebrates how African traditions have looked at showcasing and preserving cultural knowledge. Before I just share a bit about the examples of some of the programming that we recommended for Oyo State, I just wanted to talk about the United Kingdom because we're here, right? We're in Liverpool, and the UK actually has one of the most sophisticated heritage tourism sectors in the world. And there are key things for this success. First of all, they're not trying to do everything. They focus on key heritage products. So historic houses, castles, palaces, so that's the royal heritage, gardens, maritime heritage. I'm here in Liverpool, so I had to mention maritime heritage, Beatles heritage, industrial heritage. And what has happened is that there has been a strong, effective integration of the tangible and intangible that has been done by incorporating living history. Now the difference and what we can learn is that what has really helped this to work is that it's not government that is in charge of everything, right? There have been a way to create strategic management and organizations whose focus is on some of these heritage products. So we have Historic England, for example, we have the National Trust, English Heritage. We also have the Heritage Lottery Fund that also, heritage sites can bid for financing and funding. And we have examples of public-private partnerships that have really succeeded in making these work. I would also say that what has elevated it, an area that we can learn, is that there has been innovative approaches to incorporating living history. So you have interactive experiences with costume people at sites. Note this as different from what I said about the continent, which is you don't have to have a costume people because you can see how it's happening in real time, right? But we have costume people at sites, we have heritage festivals. In Edinburgh, for example, we used to have several festivals. We have heritage cities, heritage trails. We also have very strong digital innovation and historic buildings that are converted to hotels, restaurants, guest houses. And this, I guess, is where architecture also comes in to say, how can we retain some of these historic spaces but transform their programming within them so that they can be transformative spaces that can be easily adaptable for different uses, for contemporary use now, but also for future use. And what the UK has succeeded in doing is that we've been able to connect with a past in a reimagined and refreshing way that allows you to attract repeat visitors, that also allows you to target different age groups because there are different products that are created for different age groups. And in that sense, the destination also grows with the visitor. So you can experience the destination as a child, you can experience the destination as a young adult, and you can also experience the destination as an older adult. So I came to Liverpool first 20 years ago. It's very different today than it was 20 years ago. And I know that as I experience the city, I'm going to experience a different I'm going to experience a different form of tourism than I did as a university student. And so it's important that destinations are not static and can evolve and understand that different markets require different things. And I would say that as we look at heritage tourism development in Africa, one thing I keep talking to our clients about is the need for us to really think about the African tourist as not just a youth. What is really happening with a lot of our development now is that it's primarily focused on young people, which is good, but then it's not including the elderly, it's not including older people, so people that are retired, who have more free time, more disposable income, for example, so that's a huge market. Also thinking about families with children, also looking at people with disabilities. Some of the work we're really doing is also seeing how can we create more accessibility within tourism development, right, on the continent. And I was very amazed to see that looking at people with physical disabilities and neurodivergencies, we're excluding 30% of the serviceable market. That's 30% of the market that we're not including in our tourism development planning, simply because we're not thinking about them. And so for us, it's really saying how can we, and it's easy because once you make a place more accessible for people with physical disabilities, you make it accessible for people with young children, you make it accessible for people that are elderly, right? And so creating spaces that can service multiple groups of tourists or visitors also enhance our heritage tourism offerings. Okay, like I said earlier, I spoke about the opportunities and I spoke about how these opportunities were very, very idealistic, right? Because it's important to know that there are tensions that currently exist in terms of how can we harness this opportunity. And one area we have to be very careful of is over-commercialization. And I try to tell people that, yeah, we need to really understand that we don't want to run the risk of stage authenticity, but also we want to look at optimal tourism development, not maximum tourism development. And what that means is that already we start a program to avoid over-tourism. We don't want under-tourism, right? But we don't also want over-tourism, because what that does is it also creates a simplification and it reduces the significance of some of our heritage tourism sites. Another challenge that really happens, and this was really shocking to discover, it's a report by JLL, and it's that there's so much economic leakage in tourism development on the continent, where only 5% of tourism investment in Africa actually stays on the continent. A lot of the profits actually benefit foreign investors outside and also rather than the local communities. And when we think about this, it's really about saying, yes, we talk about tourism creating more work, tourism creating a lot of jobs, but what kind of jobs are we creating within these communities? Where you see that primarily a lot of the more advanced type of work and the more skills-based work are not given to those in the communities because they're not able to do the work because they haven't been given the opportunities to learn about that. So it creates opportunity for us in terms of how do we create more education, how do we create more human capability development, human capacity development, how do we develop more capabilities, but also looking at how can we, and this is for architects again, how can we ensure that when these tourist sites, hospitality locations are developed, we don't have to import everything that goes into them, because this is another part of the leakage. How do we start to strengthen craftsmanship to ensure that quality items can be done at scale, right? And so 5% is not a lot. It's not a lot actually. So for a lot of these activities going on, it's a real shame that there's so much leakage and the benefits are not trickling down because they're not actually even staying within the communities, and in many cases they're not staying within the continent. And I wanted to talk about this, and this is one of my final points in terms of the tension that we face in heritage tourism in Africa, and that explains some of the images I shared at the start, which is that for some of our sacred sites, they haven't been invested in, and the infrastructure hasn't been addressed because of the tension between spiritual and cultural heritage. And like I mentioned earlier, we've gotten religious transformations that have shaped this, but a lot of our traditions are deeply intertwined with our cultural identity, with our governance, with our daily life. And because of the suppression that they experience, the redefinition, they actually have to they go through tensions. And I'm smiling because I'm just going through several conversations where you have a policymaker that believes because of a certain, their faith, they don't believe that this heritage tourism site should even ever be developed. And so how do you start to convince them? How do you start to help them to understand that the spiritual is different from the cultural? And how do you help them understand their role and responsibility as custodians or representatives of these communities to be able to understand that they have to separate, and I have to be very careful, not separate their beliefs, but they have to understand that they're representing their communities, and so they have a responsibility to them. And you know what I usually use? I ask them, I say, so have you gone to, do you watch Harry Potter? Yes. Children watch Harry Potter? Yes. Okay, when you go to India, do you visit shrines or temples? They say yes. Okay, when you go to the UK, do you visit the Stonehenge? They say yes. Rome, the Pantheon? Yes. Like, okay, but do you know the history of some of this? Do you know the antecedents of some of this? The Pantheon, for example, it was a place for pagan worship, right, in Rome. But over time, of course, with Christianity, that has changed and evolved. And now it's seen simply as a place of cultural significance. And so how do we really also start to shape how some of these sites are seen and the perception, the image and perception that we have, that it doesn't mean that this is demonic or that it is devilish. because that is literally what it is. It's seen as it's not good, so it's demonic, and we have to do the work to also help the stakeholders to understand that these labels are not necessarily appropriate. Of course, part of the work is understanding that they're deeply connected and there needs to be respectful development of these spiritual functions and of these sacred spaces. And one area, like when we speak to high priests or etc., that are custodians of some of these sites, their focus is they want tourism development, but they also want assurances that, first of all, that the investments and developments won't stop if the policymaker changes and the person in power believes that it's demonic now and so they shouldn't do anything anymore in support. But primarily also to ensure that we don't have a loss of authenticity and we don't reduce the significance of the spaces. So what we've come up with as a model is a way to create a two-pronged approach where you still have the spiritual elements, so where the traditional worship or the chants and rituals take place, as different from where tourists can visit. And this is an example that is not new. In Japan, you can go to shrines. In India, you can go to temples, but you don't necessarily go into the inner sanctum, right? And so it's seen at how do we also negotiate these with the communities. Different communities have different requirements. Some communities will tell you you can't come to this sacred site at all, or these are areas that can be accessible for tourists, and these are areas that cannot be accessible for tourists. And so we end up being the middle people between the government, the community, and the spiritual leaders to ensure that there's understanding and there's compromise, but that there's alignment as to what the tourism development objective needs to be. And one area we also tell them is that, and this also helps, is that because heritage tourism can be a strong vehicle for shaping and providing alternative perspectives to worldview, it can also serve as a strong tool for education and enlightenment. So it's not just about entertainment. And I think when tourism is seen from this immersive experience as a living tradition that is respectful, then there is a sense of, there's a more willingness to engage with tourism from the spiritual leaders' position and their perspectives. But their concern is how respectful, and can we guarantee this respectful behavior, and can we guarantee this respectful attitude? And it comes back again to design. So part of the work we're doing is working with architects and urban planners to say how do we shape some of these locations and destinations that creates tourism trails for the tourists, but that also creates the spiritual pathways for those that are more spiritually inclined. So almost like pilgrimage trails and pilgrimage routes, so that we're even contributing, even if it's not coming to tourism, we're contributing to the elevation and the sanitization of some of these spiritual practices as well. And that has received quite a lot of positive feedback. One area that is also quite challenging is community ownership. We have this sense of learned helplessness where the government is responsible for solving all the problems. And in communities, part of where government has invested in the past, they still keep wanting the government to keep investing without taking any ownership of the community. So there needs to be significant education for communities to understand that they are the custodians and they own these sites and they're responsible for it. Government can only be create an enabling environment. And there is significant requirement for education and for education for policymakers, for investors as well, to really see the opportunity in heritage tourism. I have to say that that is another big challenge that is faced. It's just not seen as economically viable enough. But over time, once we've done, once we look at the numbers with them and we show them the opportunities and the aggregated benefits that tourism can provide, then people start to really think, oh, okay, I didn't think that this was possible or this was going to happen. So it's about creating more understanding about the value and ensuring that we unlock financing that can bring these destinations to life. So just to conclude very quickly, so this was actually done for us by MOEAA, Papa Omotayo, who's an architect. And so we were working on this together. So this was their mood board of saying, how do we change Eleyele Lake for the future? What's the programming that can be had there? So we looked at thinking about wood structure, because again, it's the lake, swampy area. We looked at the environment, the impact. We We looked at ensuring that we had low-touch development for the site, and so we have these emerging spaces for daytime activities and nighttime activities. We conceptualized looking at lakeside cottages, floating boat houses, lakeside spaces, having walking trails and having cycling trails, etc. But also still sharing with people the history and the heritage of Elegele and its significance to the people of Ibadan and Oyo State in terms of helping them to have access to water when they were still fighting wars as the empire, as the Oyo Empire. And this was done just by red clay, looking at Idere Hills, which was the hill we showed you earlier, to say there needs to be a visitor information site. There needs to be a place that people can sit. You need to think about how people can access this safely, signage, information, but you can see here that what we're showing is that creating and transforming these sites does not have to be hugely expensive, because somebody had gone with a proposal for them to put cable cars and lifts and golf courses to elevate the space. And it's like, no. If you're thinking about a heritage tourism and a historic site or a monument, you don't need to create such a long, expensive, arduous challenge for yourself, because it's going to be hard for you to finance that. You can start small, and with success, you can build incrementally. And I'll say that's something that the UK does very well here. And so in conclusion, when you really think about it, where do we go from here? Where can we go from here? I've shared some of the opportunities. I've shared some of the challenges. I've shared some of what I believe are case studies we can learn from. There's so many case studies we can learn from, but I just thought I'll pick two. And I would say that where we need to go from here, particularly for AHUWA, is really thinking about how do we create stronger programs that can develop capacity, particularly for decision makers, but also for cultural education as a collective, as a people, for more people to understand that heritage is not demonic, to understand that our history, our spirituality, and our evolution as Africans really can be a source of cultural intelligence and a source of strategic intelligence, I would say, that can help how we shape and develop our spaces, our destinations, our communities, how we create more spaces that are socially cohesive. When we learn from the development trajectory of other places in the world, I give Japan as a good example for heritage tourism, but they have issues around isolation and solitude, right? That shows that development itself has to be managed very sensitively. And so can we really think about values orientation as well? So beyond just economic empowerment, it's important that we see heritage tourism as a powerful vehicle for teaching history, promoting cultural pride, strengthening intergenerational knowledge transfer. I know everybody talks about how schools and universities can integrate heritage tourism into their curricula, but I would say that beyond just integrating it, it's even looking at what is the component of what this curriculum looks like. And I know we've shared before in the past about the importance of real stakeholder engagement, understanding how to be diplomacy, so diplomatic skills, and also understanding how to be really culturally intelligent, right? And I would say that this will shape anyone that is going to work in heritage and tourism anywhere around the world, but particularly on the continent. But creating immersive approaches to learning. So one of the things we thought for Elegele Lake as well was that we'll have outdoor forest schools, so that school children can come and connect more with the environment and understand more of these things in a tactile way, not just from their screens. And so creating immersive approaches across educational tourism, heritage tourism, right, allows us to also create a stronger sense of appreciation amongst the young Africans, where because of the homogeneity by globalization, there's a real risk that, it just feels that we start to learn again and we start to lose a lot of our tradition, a lot of our knowledge, and a lot of our knowledge systems. And there really needs to be a strong way of how do we empower local communities. In fact, I would say this is my biggest challenge right now, is ensuring that local communities control their own narratives and understand heritage management and the models that can work for them. Because any investment in heritage tourism is not going to work if the local communities are not empowered to actually manage it effectively over the long term. And And then, like I mentioned, for the policymakers, it's important that they're able to understand policies that integrate tangible. And so it's easy enough with tangible heritage, but it's intangible that is a bit problematic. But it's important that we can integrate these two so that we can create holistic and richer tourism experiences. And so the final point is that heritage tourism cannot be static. It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be participatory. We need to encourage stronger African-led tourism narratives and policy innovations. Ultimately, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to come up with frameworks and models that can attract visitors, that can preserve cultural integrity, that can drive long-term socio-economic benefits, and can really strengthen and anchor our sense of place, our sense of identity, that can influence just our worldview and how we engage and participate in the world. And I would say that my final point is that it's important that we know that our heritage isn't just to be observed, but it's important that it needs to be experienced, it needs to be immersive, and it needs to be internationalized. So that is really what we're trying to do here at Red Clay. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, that was quite a bit to take in. Thank you for bringing in the Japanese context and how something as simple as learning how to flower arrangement can, be much deeper than it is. I think now we can take comments, questions, and reflections. We'll start from the room and then we'll go to those online.
I'm Sunny. Thank you. So what would you say are the key things that successfully create a good immersive experience in tourism?
Should I proceed? So your question is, what would I say are things that create good immersive experiences for tourists? I would say, first of all, it's ensuring that the space in which the tourism experience is, the space in which tourism is experienced, right, needs to be designed intelligently, right? So one area is, if you go somewhere and it's like, we're talking about the history of this space, but nothing about the design of the space talks about the history of the space. Right? So the space has to be historically authentic, right, and connects to the destination of the community. The activities, there needs to be activities that are happening within these tourism destinations or within these experiences that are happening. So there has to be an activity or a few activities. And these activities need to be participatory. They need to have a form of, I know I mentioned that it shouldn't purely be for entertainment, but there needs to be a form of education, learning. And it needs to be something that people can do that is multisensory. So it's either they're listening to something, or they're participating with their hands or something, or they can touch and feel. Because that moves it from the static, I can just watch this, or I can just look at this at the screen. But because I'm actually at the destination itself, there's a power from touching. So the example I gave of the scissors, I could never from the image have thought that Japanese scissors were different to use. But by touching it and feeling and learning and having to learn how to use a pair of scissors, right, it just created a stronger, more immersive experience that I'm sharing now with you. And I would say that the final thing is ensuring that this experience is not too long. So looking at the kind of the time, the length of time that it takes. And I mention this because in some places you have, you want to go for a ceremony or a ritual, for example. It's important to understand that for a tourist, they are not necessarily from those communities. So for them, it's something to just give them a glimpse into how this happens in a respectful way. So thinking about the time frame as well. So immersiveness really is about the place, ensuring that it is architecturally coherent with the place itself, and ensuring that the programming of the activities are multisensory and time-based.
Thank you very much. Anybody online who wants to share, who has a question? How do we see? Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. No, this is just a contribution. I joined lately after this collection. So basically, I just want to contribute from this answer. Looking at heritage tourism as a living tradition, we should look critically to the objectives of tourism itself, towards the welfare of the community, the host community. Tourism is basically targeted at, staff development is basically targeted at developing the host communities that will ask people tourists to visit and contribute to the development of those communities. So everything needed to attract tourists should be put into consideration. So that they spend more time at the host community, thereby spend more money at the host community. So they should be captured in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps how to really integrate it with local economies, things like crafts and well, the embedded comparative advantages that certain communities have over others.
Exactly.
Thank you, Bode. One of the things that I'm curious about is perhaps in the context of Lagos, why some communities are attractive and others are not. For example, why people would go to Badagry, but Lagos Island also has a lot of heritage, built heritage at the very least. But Lagos Island, even though it's within the city core, is not as attractive as Badagry, especially for those who are coming from abroad. How do we catalyze those kinds of advantages for communities?
Absolutely. Just to respond to Olabode, absolutely. I mean, tourism that's happening in terms of communities has to be community led, and it has to also really think about ensuring that the communities benefit from tourism development work. And like I mentioned, it's not about just saying it's creating jobs, but looking at the type of work that is created. So some of what we're doing now is saying, how do we create spaces for tourism knowledge development at senior levels? So not even at entry levels, it's not at vocational levels, but at senior levels, at middle management levels, at policy making director levels, so that we can have more representatives from these local communities actually take effective destinations and manage the destinations themselves. And to your point about Lagos Island vis-a-vis Badagry, I would say that it's because Badagry is more, the Badagry economy really is focused on tourism development, right? And it's on tourism activity. Lagos Island is not as accessible, so accessibility is a question. When I talk about accessible, it's the sense of the narrative is you have to go with someone that will ensure that you're not going to get bombarded by the area boys. It's really usually area boys. So you have to know a guide who you trust, who can take you there. And some of the tour guides that we have there are very well trained, but some also are opportunists. So the experience is not as cohesive and is not as I think I mentioned this for Ijore. It's the sense of, it's not just about seeing the built heritage, but bringing it to life and transporting the visitors to what these sites are. So Badagry, for example, has a stronger sense of, because you're going on this journey and you have tour guides that are quite experienced and that can really share authentic stories and narratives about the journey of Badagry. Whereas in Lagos Island, and I know this because I've gone on several tours, because we're working with actually Lagos State to see how we can also create Lagos Island as a cultural portal for Lagos. And it just depends on who you speak to. The story that you get is seen, it varies, and so it's that sense of how do we create more documentation, more codification, so that you have you have written material that can also guide the tourist experience. And there's just this sense in people's minds that Lagos Island is this hustling and bustling space. and it can be difficult to penetrate unless you go there on a Sunday. And so how do we also reshape this? Well, we did some work a while ago, this is before COVID, on residents' perspectives for tourism development in Lagos Island as well. And one of the issues that they said was that a lot of the tourism development activities that is happening, so cultural activities, programming, does not actually include the residents and consider them. They see that it is for an upper middle class clientele, and Lagos Island over time, because of gentrification, etc., a lot of the indigenes have actually moved out of the space because also of safety concerns, etc. So it's that sense of how can we create more spaces for us to make us more welcoming of tourists. So it comes back again to stakeholder engagement, it comes back again to negotiation, it comes back again that before we start to do policies, we need to understand what do the residents want, how do they engage in leisure activities. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. We can't think of just the tourists alone, we also need to think about the residents and say, what are the activities that they engage in and how do we elevate this, right? And how do we ensure that when tourists do come here, they can experience the authentic lives of the residents as opposed to, and I'm sorry to say this, a static representation of this building was this end, where there's none of that interaction as such. So that's really one of the key challenges of Lagos Island.
All right, thank you very much. Any other comments, questions? Okay, I think we can just give you a round of applause and